Hi, this is Glenda, and today I'm making a chocolate cake soap, which is inspired by a real chocolate cake that I bake every year for my husband on his birthday. Here I have the melted oils, and I'm going to add the light water solution. Then I'm going to blend this to emulsion phase, and I thought that I would do it on slow motion because it may look cool, and it kind of does. What do you think? My light water solution, by the way, was at room temperature since I make it ahead, and the oils were a little bit under 90 degrees, I think, because my plan was to add powdered goat milk and I was trying to avoid the soap from overheating. Here I'm gonna take the temperature of the mix, and as you can see, it's at 89 Fahrenheit, almost 90. I wanted to create a layer look. For the cake layers, I'm using dark rich chocolate from Berry because it discolors to a very dark brown, so it will match the actual color of the cake. And then for the filling, I'm going to use chocolate fragrance oil from Crafter's Choice. This one has less vanillin, so it doesn't discolor as dark as the other one. Initially, I was blending this with spatulas, but because the consistency felt very thin, I decided to stick blend it. This caused the butter to become thicker than I expected it to be. I practically had to spoon over the second and third layers. I do remember that this chocolate fragrance tends to accelerate, but it could also be because my recipe has a lot of solid fats and oils. As I added each layer, before doing so, I tried to clean up the edges of the mold with the small spatula so that the layers could be more visible and more clean without me having to trim all of the edges. The main risk when your soap batter is too thick is that there will be air pockets, and I did try to avoid them by tapping the soap mold against the counter several times, and I did see some bubbles come up that way, but I still had some air pockets in there. To decorate the top, I'm gonna use this scraper. This is actually a cake scraper, and I was gonna go this way, but it didn't fit, so I turned it to the other side and it worked better. I had made some soap dough chocolate hearts, and I'm putting these on top because normally when I do make this cake in real life, I will put some sort of chocolate like this on top as well. I unmolded it the next day and also cut it. It actually felt really hard and it was giving me some trouble to cut it, but I was able to do it in the end. Just go slowly with the wires. Next, I'll show you some pictures of how it looked as it discolored in the course of a week. I was not a fan of the fragrance as it was curing, but it did get better once the cure finished. Next, I'm going to show you how to make the actual chocolate cake. I start by making some coffee, and then I weigh all of the dried ingredients into a container per the recipe. The recipe for this is from a book, and I'm going to give you more information about the book on the blog post, which will be linked in the description box below. Once all of the dried ingredients are weighed out into a container, I move them to a food processor and I process them just to do this in place of having to sift them. The idea is to incorporate air, and this is what I've read that Alton Brown does in a book that I have of his, and it seems easier than sifting all of it. Next, I get all the wet ingredients ready. Normally, the recipe calls for buttermilk. I didn't have enough, so I'm substituting with some Greek yogurt and whole milk, which is also one of the options from the book. Actually, I think I have 2% milk, not whole, but it still worked. To the wet ingredients, I add the coffee, which by now has come to room temperature. Before adding the eggs, I like to break them into a separate container. That way, if there is any shell pieces, I can fish them out before they go into the main mix. Once all of the ingredients are measured and in their containers, I start preparing the pans. I normally do this cake in two layers. I have tried doing more than 2 layers, but the cake is too moist and fragile to do that, so I'd rather just keep it to 2. At the same time, I've also started warming up the oven to the temperature that the recipe calls for. I also make sure that there is a rack in the center of the oven, so that's where I will be putting the cake pans. The next step is to bring it together. So I'm going to beat all the wet ingredients together, and then I'm going to mix them into one container with the dry ingredients. This mix is going to be blended only slightly, actually not even blended. I'm just stirring it with a whisk because we want to preserve as many of the bubbles as possible. Here I'm just trying to get all the dried ingredients wet, and once I don't see any more dry pockets, I stop. By now the oven has usually reached the desired temperature, so I put them into each pan and I try to make sure they are at the same level. So I distribute the mix as much as I can equally among the 2 pans. Then I'll just bring them to the oven and I push them as far as they'll go, so they'll be closer to the back where it's warmer. I set a timer and this is how they look when they're almost done. The timer went off, so I took one of the pans off and I did the test where you put something pointy to see if it comes out wet or dry. It came out dry, so I took the other pan out, and I'm also gonna test the second pan and I'll show you in a second how that looks. Another way you can tell it's cooked is because the edges begin to pull away from the edge of the pan. So this is my tester. I put it in the center of the pan, and when it comes out it's clean, so that's how I know that it's ready. This is going to be the container in which I'm going to bring this cake over to my sisters. So I'm going to put one of the cakes on this to cool down. It's been cooling down on top of the rack for however long the book says to do it, but now I'm going to unmold it, and I don't dare just pulling it from the straps because I feel it may break. So I just flipped it over on this and I'm going to let it keep cooling overnight. Well, it is the next day and I'm going to work on the frosting. I also follow a recipe from the same book. It's a dark chocolate frosting, and it starts with some bittersweet chocolate that is going to be melted, and at the beginning I'm just chopping it off into small pieces so that it can melt evenly. You can do this on the microwave or you can do it on the stovetop. I rather do it on the stovetop because there is less risk of burning the chocolate. So I weigh this into a small pot and I'm going to add the heavy cream that the recipe calls for and melt it in low heat over the burner. I stir this continuously until it looks like this. There's no more lumps and no more unmelted pieces of chocolate. You also have to be careful not to burn it even if you're doing it on the stovetop. I'm actually going to sift the powdered sugar and the cocoa powder in the way that I will normally do it if I didn't use the food processor, because I just washed it from using it last night and I don't want to have to wash it again. I also have here some butter. I'm using Kerrygold unsalted and salted butter, and I plan to use 1 bar of each for the frosting. I normally use the KitchenAid mixer for this one, but any other mixer can do, even the handheld ones. And once you've blended the chocolate with the butter, and not all of the butter, just some of it to begin with, just follow the recipe for that. Then you start adding the sifted powdered sugar and cocoa powder mix to it, and I try to do that gradually, not everything at once, because otherwise you get this cloud of white sugar in the air. Then I add the vanilla extract, the remaining of the dry mix, and the last portion of the butter until it looks like it's shiny. And I think I'm going to use the full portion of the butter that the recipe calls for. That way I have enough to cover the sides of the cake, the middle, and the top. Once the frosting is ready, it's time to start adding it to the cake. I try to have a fairly thick but not too thick layer in the middle, because if I do make it too thick, then I'm not going to have enough to cover the sides and the top. So I try to just aim for, I'll say maybe in between a half inch and a quarter inch, somewhere in between that. Once this layer is been added, the tricky part will be putting the second cake sheet on top. And to do that, I normally try to use this big spatula that I bought online. I'll show it to you in just a second. I think it's Cake Boss brand. But even with this, I had some difficulty because this cake is so moist that it was sticking to it. So it wasn't allowing me to just slide it in. In the end, I think I just had to flop it onto the other one and be careful with it. Just try to do it so that it's even, because it's also not going to be easy to move it around once it's on. So it did take me a minute to put it on. But anyway, this is the main part of it. Once I cover the top and the sides, it's just a matter of deciding if you want to go any further with the decoration. I normally don't. I just do, in this case, I use the spatula. It has some scallop edge, and I use that to create some decoration. Other years, I add some chocolate shavings. In other years, I just put some chocolates on top. So it depends on what you want to do with it. But for me, this is plenty. The cake itself is not very sweet, despite all the sugar that it has. I think because of the chocolate that tends to have a bitter note. So anyway, thank you for watching and see you next time. Bye.